We're going to go ahead and kick off the afternoon session in just a minute or two. So if everyone can start to take their seats. Okay, well, welcome back from probably one of the longest lunch breaks that we've ever taken at the council. I've been doing this for over a decade, and that was a long one. And it stinks when your staff are all listening to the meeting and then they realize you're not running a meeting anymore. So you have to take care of stuff back at home. So welcome back from lunch. We have 2 items on this afternoon's agenda. The first one is going to be a presentation by Jason Didden on the 2022 Illex Specifications. But before we start, and I hope they're listening, but we have a new person at the table. I was going to ask Emily to introduce yourself for the purpose of just people on the webinar, just to make sure that when you speak later, if you have to, that people know who you are.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Emily Gilbert, and I work in the Sustainable Fisheries Division of GARFO. I am the supervisor of a number of fisheries, and one of them being squid, mackerel, butterfish, along with scallops and herring, and I also deal with forage. So it's a pleasure to be back here and seeing everyone, and hello to everyone on the webinar.
All right, thanks, Emily. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Jason at this time to provide us with the presentation, and then we'll need to consider the recommended changes that we're going to go through for 2022. So Jason, if you're all ready, it's all you.
Thank you. So again, we're just looking at 2022, not 2023 yet. That'll be later in the year based on, we have a management research track assessment and a management track assessment. So right now for 2021 and 2022, we're at 33,000 metric ton ABC. 4.61% is set aside for discards. This is a recent average. We updated that within the last year or two. It didn't change much from what it was previously. That gets you your quota, 31,478. And currently we close at 94% of that, which translates poundage or weight wise into 1,889 metric ton buffer. So we're in multi-year specs. There's technically no action required, but we do have new ABCs from the SSC. So we'll see how things go. 2 things to kind of keep in mind in the background here. One, we're waiting on the reviews for the research track assessment. There was a depletion model that I'll describe as kind of a work in progress at this point, trying to look at a weekly step-by-step, how is the stock reacting to the fishery? And then a large suite of indirect analyses, some of which were kicked off by the Quota working group that the council set up 3 or 4 years now, and put together a range of analyses that the reviewers kind of described as a kitchen sink approach. If we don't have a traditional direct assessment, what are some other ways we can try to gain some insight into the stock? So that review is being finalized. It's not really clear, at least to me, how different a situation we may be in later this year. We may be in a very similar situation as we are now. The reviewers may come back and say, hey, these indirect methods, they look really great to us, and go use them. Or they may say, yeah, they're interesting, but we don't really know if they're going to be able to be directly applied for management. We're just going to have to kind of wait and see exactly what their language is on their reviews. But the other thing to keep in mind in the background, staff is wrapping up edits this week on the Illex Permit Action EA, get that back to NIMS. They'll do a proposed rule. then comments, then if they approve it and implement it, that could affect 2023, but not 2022. So this is fishery performance in 2021, ended up close to 98% of the quota. You know, the slopes of the blue and orange lines, they're pretty similar. The fishery started off a bit earlier in 2021 versus 2020. This is 2020 and 2019. They were very close in terms of week-to-week performance. Also caught about 98% of the quota in 2020. So those 2 years were just about right on. 2018 and 19, we had some overages that translated into some small ABC overages as well. I'm not going to go into detail on those, but you know, the last 4 years, we kind of had 2 years where I had some overages and 2 years were pretty much right on, a little bit below the quota. So the advisory panel's fishery performance report, the main point was stability. There's a bit of a price increase, but they pointed out it's only a few cents per pound for this fishery, and kind of reiterating that we're a drop in the bucket in world squid. Just the Argentinian short fin squid fishery alone is about 250,000 metric tons. So, you know, we're just a small part of the world squid market that really is driving more supply in terms of what prices our industry sees. There's a good bit of work in the assessment done on what environmental conditions might be driving Illex availability and abundance in a given year. So AP really would like, there were fishermen integrated into that process. They'd really like to see that continue. And then we got some kind of opposing perspectives on kind of, does the current quota approach sufficiently account for Illex's role as forage? Both folks thinking that maybe there should be more accounting for forage needs, or what we're doing now is sufficient. Dr. Rago can go through and provide some additional detail for the SSC, from the SSC.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to open by stating that I served as a contractor to the council in order to prepare much of what you'll be seeing in the subsequent slides. And so to avoid any appearance of conflict of interest, I recused myself during the SSC meeting. The meeting was chaired by Dr. Mike Wilberg, and the session was led by Dr. Tom Miller. So I did not have direct involvement with the discussions or the conclusions of this, although you know I did present in detail the methodology that I used. I just wanted to make that well known to the members of the council. My work was limited to that which is associated with evaluating catch limits. It did not include work that I was not compensated for, which was participating in the research track assessment. So, so the object was to evaluate alternative catch limits, and that range was 24,000 to 60,000 metric tons for this year. It built upon the methods that I'd used in 2021, and also some advances within and refinements developed within the research track assessment. I thank the center, Lisa Hendrickson in particular, for providing me with the commercial landings and the fall bottom trawl survey data from 97 through 2021. There were a couple of years missing in there for reasons described earlier. And you know, the catch data for 2021 are, of course, preliminary. The catch limits were evaluated with respect to two measures. First being the percentage escapement, and I'll get into that, and then also this ratio of fishing mortality to natural mortality. So that is in fact a consideration, or has been used as a consideration of forage value. The percentage escapement is kind of a theoretical value in the sense that it is the ratio of the fished population that is actually what you observe at the end of the fishing season, and that is measured by the fall survey index. And there's unfished stock at the end of the fishing season, which is a projection that is based on, well, what would this population size have been in the absence of a fishery? So next slide, please. Those computations rely on three critical parameters, the first being catchability, the second being availability, and the third being the instantaneous natural mortality rate. So catchability is essentially the probability of capture per tow, that is, given that the tow occurs at a certain point over the seabed, what fraction of the resource is captured. The availability is much more complicated because it's the fraction of the stock that's in the sampling domain. That is a dynamic process, and it varies quite a bit from year to year. And then finally is natural mortality, which again for squid is very, very high, owing to their very short lifespan of 7 to 9 months. These were uncertainty in these parameters was evaluated using a distribution of values, and so I just had upper and lower bounds on those, and then I integrated that over the entire parameter space. By that I mean this is a numerically intensive method that evaluated all possible combinations of values for catchability, availability, and natural mortality rate. Now there's a big, exceptionally long and dull report that I prepared to the council that kind of goes into some of those details. Next slide, please. The basic results, they're, if you need to look at it in two phases here. First is look at the actual catches that occurred. So between 97 and 2021, the estimated probability of falling below a 50% escapement target was about 13%. So that is using the actual catches. So over that period, there was very low risk of falling below an escapement target. With respect to exceeding a F/M ratio of 2/3, which has been proposed as a potential value. Again, none of these are confirmed or approved ABCs, or excuse me, biological reference points. That was less than 21%. So the probability of exceeding that was, so that one of the conclusions was that the historical catches are unlikely to have resulted in overfishing during this period. Now, the second way of looking at this is to look at hypothetical alternative catches. And so what you do in this instance is you look at a suite of values, in this case, 24,000 to 60,000 metric tons, and evaluate them over all of the survey years that are available, 97 through 2021. So then you can evaluate how a alternative catch history would have performed given that it was applied in a year that over the historical time period. So the idea is to look at the terminal year population sizes for a whole suite of years, and then evaluate it, that probability, or estimate that probability by looking at it as an overall average. Now, of course, this statistical theory can advise on the consequences of alternative catches, but the choices related to the appropriate risk are matters of policy, not science. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I said, the methodology more fully considered the uncertainty in catchability, availability, and natural mortality rates. These were refined by comparisons with values, not only in the scientific literature, but also analyses that were prepared in support of the research track assessment, and notably John Manderson, Brooke Lohman, and Anna Mercer. Availability, again, was also improved by those getting information on the seasonal bottom trawl surveys, both in the US and Canada, but again, acknowledging they did not consider the unsampled population and possibly extensive offshore populations. Estimates of catchability were improved by looking at some calibration experiments and through expert judgment of fishermen. And then finally, The natural mortality rates were based on values used in the literature, notably Hendrickson and Hart in 2006. Next slide, please. So that kind of summarized the discussions that occurred before the SSC went into what we call terms of reference mode, that is addressing specific requests from the council related to catch recommendations. So in this context, the first term of reference was to see if the current catch of 33,000 metric tons is still warranted, and if an adjustment is appropriate. We noted that it was a data poor species, and that the SSC commented that the enhanced numerical analysis was useful, and it allowed for a basis for an alternative ABC determination. Next slide, please. Among the conclusions accepted by the SSC, they noted that the escapement has been relatively high over the last 10 years, suggesting a relatively small impact of the fishery on the component of the stock that is exploited. These assumptions that were related to the selection of the parameters were thought to lead to minimum likely estimates. That is, it's likely that the true value is probably lower than what is actually estimated in this. The distribution also suggested exploitation in this fishery is likely low. The comparisons with these empirical, again, these are not biological reference points in the strict sense, but they are empirical, and they relate well to those in squid fisheries elsewhere, and are sort of associated with low risk of exceeding the escapement standards. One caveat, of course, was that these analyses do not consider any autocorrelation in the dynamics of squid, and that could affect not only the stock recruitment dynamics, but also influenced by environmental drivers. We'll be seeing more of this information as we advance to the research track assessment results later in the year. But one thing that is clear, of course, is that there's the high levels of abundance that have been seen over the last 5 years may or may not continue into the future. So there's always that consideration. So this was sort of factored in or baked into the decisions and discussions that the SSC found. Next slide, please. So the bottom line recommendation highlighted here is that the SSC believes that an ABC of 33,000 metric tons for 2022 is no longer warranted. Instead, the SSC recommends an ABC for 2022 of 40,000 metric tons based on these following lines of evidence. The first, it's consistent with the SSC discussions last year that noted, basically a desire to increase the ABC, but there was not enough exploration of the information available. So the range of alternatives was somewhat restricted last year to 2. It noted that this is an incremental approach, which is consistent with approaches that the SSC has adopted previously. And then based on the overall time series, it's consistent with a low chance of falling below an escapement level of 40%, and that value has been used in other squid fisheries. There was only about a 6% chance that you would fall below a 40% escapement. There's a relatively moderate risk or slightly higher risk of having a ratio of F over M exceeding 2/3, and that was about 20%. But again, that is not a one that has been accepted or as part of the SSC or the the council's biological reference points. It is one that has been used in other fisheries, so it's just simply there as a way of illustrating it was considered. And then overall, the SSC believes this ABC will lead to a low risk of overfishing. The SSC did not feel comfortable increasing ABCs above this level because they continue to see, lack a clear link between escapement, the F/M ratio, and risk of overfishing. So that was sort of the bottom line recommendations. Of course, the usual next slide is the sources of uncertainty associated with this. Next slide, please. There we go. Thank you. Sort of a lack of a peer-reviewed OFL, overfishing limit, puts some substantial uncertainty in the foundation of the ABC. These are data poor approaches, and these have been used in other squid fisheries and used to promote sustainability of exploited forage species. There's continued uncertainty over the fraction and the interannual variability of squid population that's subject to exploitation. Depending on oceanographic conditions, there can be substantial variation in the fraction of the population that intersects with the shelf break and the fishing areas. It goes without saying we have a poor understanding of the stock recruitment process. The recruitment and birth of new squid occurs probably over the course of the entire year. However, we don't have direct evidence of that, but we do have some evidence. There's this lack of coherence or understanding of the coherence with environmental drivers. And again, there's ongoing work both with the oceanographers, the biologists, and members of industry to help improve those. The estimates of catchability, availability, and natural mortality are uncertain, and they've been assumed in this analysis to be uncorrelated. So they may be, in fact, be correlated, and that may be a subject for further investigation. So the final statement, that is the SSC believes these recommendations meet standard guidelines for best scientific information available. They do not, of course, this is not the definitive word that authority resides with the agency. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to do a quick summary of public comments. They noted that the use of escapement targets in squid fisheries are now common around the world, and the Marine Stewardship Council now recommends the use of escapement targets in their most recent guidance documents. So, and furthermore, that fisheries operating under such targets have generally been stable. It was noted that there's a high economic and social importance of this fishery, especially when other pelagic fishing opportunities are declining. This thing ties in nicely with comments that Sarah made yesterday in terms of ecosystem or community resiliency and factors of that nature. And then there was also a comment that the fishing area itself is small relative to the total stock area, and that there is some protection afforded the resource through the short season length. And then as citing observations of fish offshore, it's been noted that research vessel tows have caught fish at depths greater than 2,500 meters, which is well outside the range of the survey domain. And then finally, just to echo the concerns about resiliency of communities, it was noted that the ex-vessel value alone is an insufficient measure of economic value, that it extends well beyond the landed value, and of course includes the job opportunities and ice and fuel and so forth. So that concludes my presentation, and I'll turn it back over to Jason.
Thank you, Paul. So fortunately, Paul's internet was working. Otherwise, you would have gotten a very brief summary here. Again, so the SSC increased the ABC to 40,000 based on low overall risk of overfishing, but uncertain beyond 40. So the monitoring committee was basically working off of that in terms of considering additional specifications. Monitoring committee had some discussion that we've had some recent improvements in the projection approaches and reporting in Illex, and that the amount of buffer last year might be sufficient, but overages are going to be less likely at the current 94% buffer. But whether it's 94, 95, 96%, overages or underages are going to be possible either way, just due to the high volume nature of the fishery and the procedures that NIMS has to use to project and close the fishery. So the regs say that the charge of the monitoring committee is to recommend measures that would ensure the specs are not exceeded. And so kind of based on that, as the monitoring committee's charge found no strong rationale to recommend changing from the current 94% closure threshold until more years closure performances could be evaluated. Again, kind of trying to adhere to that charge to ensure that the specs are not exceeded. So the committee, stepping back for a second to the overall specifications, the committee recommended that for 2022, the Illex specifications be reset, taking advantage of the higher ABC and maintaining the same set aside for discards. There's a bit of an alphabet soup there that's a bit of a carryover from the past foreign fishery, but that's how we set the specs for Illex. Then the monitoring committee also recommended changing the closure threshold from 94% to 96%. And there's more detail in the briefing documents, but the kind of summary was that the committee decided that kind of balance the potential for overages and underages, and that based on recent performance, a 96% closure buffer seemed enough. And when you kind of look at what that would translate into for weight, it's 1,526 metric tons of kind of buffer room there. That's kind of in between the amounts in terms of weight of buffer between that we saw in 2020, 2021. Again, the quota was smaller in 2020, and that's part of the reason why the 4% is still, in terms of metric tons, a bit more of a buffer than 2020, but not as much as 2021. And I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jason. So we have recommendations that have come out on behalf of the monitoring committee and the SSC that we need to consider, but I'll first look for questions. Anybody have any questions of Dr. Rago or Jason at this time? Okay, seeing no hands, does anyone from the public have anything they'd like to ask? Okay, seeing no hands there as well. I guess we'd need to, with no questions and no discussion at this time, like to go to Peter Hughes, who chairs the Mackerel Squid Butterfish Committee. As Jason mentioned, there was a meeting regarding the direction that we would consider today. So Peter, I'm going to turn to you for the motions that were made on behalf of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There were two motions made on behalf of the committee. The first motion reads, I move that for the 2022 Illex specifications, ABC equal 40,000 metric tons, IOY equals DAH equals DAP equals 38,156 metric tons. I will note that this motion passed the committee 10-0-0. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Peter, for your committee motion. It is a committee motion, so there is no need for a second. Is there any discussion on the motion? Any discussion? Is there any objection to the motion? Mike Penny?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, not an objection. Just to note that procedurally, this is not, we're not doing normal specs for Illex, so this would require some sort of in-season action. So I'm just wondering if it would be more appropriate for the motion to read as a request for the agency to take in-season action to modify 2022 specs as suggested here.
Would you like to make that in the form of an amendment to the motion? You want to amend the motion to read that way? Would it be more clear to do it that way?
Yeah, I think that would be more clear.
Okay.
You got it, Jason, or you need me to say words?
Just give me 1 minute. Did I capture your intent there?
Yeah, Mike, I think you said modify, but is it just okay? It's fine. Okay, so we have a motion made on behalf of Mike Penny. Get a second for that motion. Peter Hughes seconds the motion. Discussion of the motion to amend? Seeing none, is there any objection to the motion to amend? Seeing no objection, motion carries. Are there any abstentions? That's the motion to become the main motion, right? All right, so now we have a main motion, which was just amended. Is there any objection to the motion? Are there any abstentions? One abstention. Motion carries with one abstention by the National Marine Fisheries Service. Peter, you have another motion? We'll give it Jason a second here, and then we can take up the second motion.
Yep, we do have another motion to address, and we'll give Jason that moment to line us up. Okay, if I may. The second motion today, I move that the fishery close with a 96% directed fishery threshold. That motion also passed committee 10-0-0. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thanks, Peter. The motion on behalf of the committee does not need a second. Is there any discussion? Mike, let me ask you, is there a need to have a similar type of amendment for this motion? Since it's in season?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just, I'm unclear. Emily is checking to see whether we can actually change the trigger threshold through an in-season action. Jason may know off the top of his head, and I'll defer to him if he does, but otherwise we're checking internally to see what the appropriate process is to change the threshold.
Okay, we'll just hang on then until we get some confirmation on that.
I apologize. We should have been prepared for that because we knew this was coming, but we hadn't thought through the mechanism.
I think I found it in the regs. So it says the MAFMC may at any time initiate action to adjust. I know there's a framework, sorry.
I guess the other way we could take it on would be we could vote on the motion, and then depending on whether or not you can or can't do it. Need some Jeopardy music.
So I think the regs say the specifications established pursuant to this section may be adjusted by the RA in consultation with the MAFMC during the fishing year by publishing notification in the Federal Register. So it would seem fairly broad authority to bundle these two together, but that's just a quick reading of the regs. GC may have thoughts.
Mike?
Mr. Chairman, maybe your suggestion is best, is just to pass the motion with, I think, clear that the intent of the council is for this to be done for the current fishing year. And then if upon, further review, we determine we're unable to do that through an in-season action, then we can let the council know. And then the council would fold it into the specs for next year. But that if we're able to do it through in-season, we will.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to be the easiest way to do it at this point. Adam Nowalski, I saw your hand. Did you still have something you wanted to offer?
Yeah, I just wanted to raise that unless I missed something during the committee discussion, I don't ever remember the issue about not being able to make this change potentially being discussed in committee. So I just think the record needs to be clear when the committee made this recommendation, whether or not they had that information, whether this could or could not be done for the current fishing year. And again, my recollection of that committee meeting was that it was not made clear to the committee that this may not be able to be implemented.
Yeah, I have the same recollection of that discussion, and there was a discussion regarding the percentage in going forward. Let me see if Jason wants to speak to that. Go ahead, Jason.
I'll just flag that this percentage has been changed in the specifications process before. And with the in-season adjustment being changes to specifications, it seems, kind of within past precedent, but again, we'll see how things turn out.
Okay, with those statements and the recommendation from Mike Pentney to take up the motion, let me ask, is there any discussion on the motion? Is there any objection to the motion? Mike?
All right. I still think it would be helpful for the motion to be clarified that the intent of the council or the committee in this case is that this be done for the 2022 fishing year.
Peter?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So Jason, can you scroll up to the previous motion that we just passed? Oh, yep, you can shrink it down. That's fine, so we can see them both. So then would we, is it your recommendation that we build in the similar language in the beginning of this motion as we did the previous motion we just took action on? Would that provide the clarity?
Yeah, I mean, if Mike,
Yeah, I think
if
that's
Mike
fine.
thinks that's going to be more clear, we would,
Either that or do we just add the 2022 fishing year? Does that provide the clarity? Okay, because the language is there in the previous motion, so I think part of that would carry through. So then we would need an amendment to this motion, or Or can this be done as a friendly, adding a 2022 fishing year?
Yeah, I think the intent was for the 2022 fishing year. So when the committee discussed it, that was the full intent of the committee. So I'm comfortable, as long as John's okay, just adding the 2022 fishing year to this motion as a committee motion. And Peter, I'll ask you just to read it into the record again.
Okay. Jason, you good? Okay. So I will read the motion into the record. I move that the 2022 fishery close with a 96% directed fishery threshold. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Peter. So we now have a motion that specifically clarifies the intent of the committee and the discussion that happened at the committee level. So let me ask again, is there any discussion on the motion? Are there any objections to the motion? Are there any abstentions to the motion? Seeing none, motion carries by consent, unanimous consent. So Jason, is there anything else that needs to come before the council today on this issue?
That's it for Illex.
Okay, excellent. I think what we can try to do, since that went relatively quickly, we can step into the Atlantic Mackerel rebuilding 2.0 amendment, approve alternatives for public hearing document. We've got a little more time on the agenda for this, so what I may suggest is that that Jason provide the presentation, and then we can take a short break if necessary, and then we'll come back for the discussion. So Jason, if you're ready to go, you can go ahead and get started.
Thank you. Okay, two big picture things today. One, review Atlantic Mackerel rebuilding, kind of the plan that the document lays out. And then if the council has any recommendations for the document, also be looking for kind of a final approval of moving forward. We do have hearings scheduled for late April on the books, assuming the council wants to move forward with that. Going to do a bit of some background just to make sure everyone's kind of starting from kind of a common place here. This story starts off with the 2018 benchmark. The benchmarks are now what we call the research track assessments. It used data through 2016 and found that the stock was overfished, with overfishing occurring and overfishing having been occurring for quite some time. Now, the projections done, building off of that assessment, the council used to set up the first rebuilding plan, projected that biomass would be around 160,000 metric tons in 2019. So that's projecting forward 3 years, 2016, 17, 18, 19. So now, kind of the next, why we're revisiting this again, in 2021, we had the management track assessment. And it actually used data through 2019, found the stock was still overfished, still overfishing, overfishing coming down, the mortality rate coming down, but still overfishing. And biomass in 2019 was around 40,000 metric tons as estimated versus projected. So, we were off by a factor of 4, even just starting rebuilding. Going into our rebuilding plan. We're at 40,000 versus 160,000. So the 2021 management track found that biomass had been trending up since 2014, but I think the big picture here to take away is that projections are inherently uncertain. At least with an assessment, you're looking at data that has occurred, you've gathered. The projections, by their very nature, and it's true with every projection, have to utilize a lot of assumptions, and sometimes things don't pan out. The other thing in terms of uncertainty I wanted to flag, and when we're looking back at the 1997 specifications, the allowable biological catch then was set at about 10 times what we now think the spawning stock biomass was. Again, so in the past, we were way off. That's part of what led us into this overfishing and overfished situation. So the SSC kind of given the management track, the update with data through 2019, given having gone through the first rebuilding attempt, advised a long-term approach in terms of rebuilding. But the monitoring committee has suggested that in this particular action, the council only set the actual specifications, quotas, management measures for 2023. Why is that? Well, we're getting a 2023 assessment that should be able to be used for 2024. Even just 2023 is already 4 years out from our assessment. You saw how far off we were at 3 years, 4 years, could be further off than even we saw last time. Hopefully not because of some differences in the projections that we'll talk about later. But nonetheless, even 2023 is 4 years. 2024 is probably going to change from whatever we project. It may not do anyone kind of a favor to kind of give a sense of more certainty about what 2024 is going to be. I think there's a lot of uncertainty there. We're in this situation of getting assessments every other year. It's tricky because we're making changes based on 2019 data. That was even before the first rebuilding plan was really implemented. It was implemented right at the end of 2019. So that's kind of a bit of a funny situation, but the advantage is we do get these updates and allows kind of an adaptive approach as we get new information, and it requires to integrate that information fairly quickly. Dr. Rego is going to give some input from the SSC. One thing I just wanted to summarize before we get there is Dr. Rego will be talking a bit about the council's your P-star risk deduction. Generally, for a stock in good shape, it's used that if you're at a lower biomass, the council wants greater certainty about not overfishing, so that translates into lower catch. That's kind of the standard application, and it's normally applied to the overfishing threshold, the mortality rate F that creates overfishing. One of the alternatives does this exact approach. Another alternative kind of applies the same buffering to a rebuilding F. And in that case, instead of avoiding overfishing, it's at lower biomass, you want greater certainty about trying to head in the right direction at the pace you thought you were going to head. So to the alternatives, we'll describe this P-star risk policy. I just wanted to kind of give a quick summary of how it works and kind of why the council set that up as an option in the first place. And I will turn to Dr. Rego. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Paul is fine here. Dr. Rego's superfluous here. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to give a little overview of the SSC's deliberations. I have about 10 slides, so it's not too lengthy. But of course, as Jason has set up there were 5 distinct options that were approved by council are recommended for considerations. And what they're distinguished by are various assumptions. 1, with respect to the nature of the underlying recruitment. 2, with respect to the desired probability of rebuilding. Do we want it to be 50%, or do we want to be more certain that we're going to achieve rebuilding over this 10-year time frame? And then finally, as Jason just described, the risk for each proposed catch trajectory is also a key factor, and that's the P-star consideration. Do we treat an F rebuild as an OFL, or is it more appropriately treated as simply here's a catch fishing mortality rate that will lead to rebuilding? And as he noted, of course, the management track assessment revealed we were far behind our earlier projections. And then the other thing is that the council had requested that it does rely on that overfishing CV of 150%. So next slide, please. Okay, so the rebuilding risk policies sort of fall into several camps here. You know, the first is the one where you want a 50% probability by in 10 years. The second is to simply apply the P-star strategy as if nothing else is happening, but in fact, is it sufficient to induce or create situations in which rebuilding is likely? A third kind of element there is, you know, can we go a little bit higher on that probability of rebuilding, such that it's 60%? And then the final one is to use a rebuild F of along with, in conjunction with, the P-star value, so that there is an option that has that. Now, central to all of these is our understanding of what we think we know about recruitment. And as Jason has noted, that is probably one of the most uncertain aspects of all projections and probably of all fisheries science. But current recruitment has been low. We don't know the reason why, and we don't know whether it's going to continue in the future. But if we assert or assume that the recruitment is low and is similar to what we've seen in the last 10 years or so, then that's one set of assumptions. The other one is that there's a kind of a general dependency in that larger stock size results in larger recruitment on the average. We don't know the precise mechanism or formulation of that recruitment relationship, but there are several ways in which that can be done. And one that was chosen by the SSC for consideration was kind of what we call a two-stage model. That is, when recruitment is, or when stock biomass is low, that is below half the MSY, we assume that the recruitment will also be low. So that's the low recruitment 2009 onward. When the spawning stock biomass exceeds 1/2 MSY, then we assume that all possible historical recruitments are feasible. So it's kind of like a slow start router in terms of, it says, okay, we're currently in a low condition. We expect that to continue until we actually have some higher spawning stock biomass, and that can occur through over half. So the next slide, please. This is just a reconsideration of the actual term of reference that the SSC examined here, and it suggested different probabilities of rebuilding along with different recruitment assumptions, and those are sort of captured in the next slide. Thank you. So here, what we're looking at is a set of scenarios which incorporate the sets of assumptions I just mentioned. The risk policy is in the first column, so it's a 50% probability of recovery, a 60% probability in item 3, and 50% at the base, and then finally the last option, rebuild F with P-star, means compute a P-star value for each rebuild F and deduct catches further. So the recruitment levels are basically into two bins here. The first is we assume that the low recruitment is going to continue forever, and then the next 4 options have recruitment as sort of the split two-stage recruitment policy. So when you apply these, and again, thank Kirsten Curdy, who worked diligently to run all of these simulations and projections here. There's about 1% of the work involved has been reduced into these this simple table here. But you know, all of the rebuild percents meet the basic objective under which they were created, that is to exceed, equal or exceed the risk policy specifications. They rebuild anywhere from 2031 to as early as 2029, and that is induced primarily because of that extra buffering occurs by applying P-star to the rebuild F. The median catches vary quite a bit. If you assume that 50% probability of rebuilding coupled with low recruitment, the catches are going to be about 700 or 800 tons in 23 and 24. That is a consequence directly of the fact that we do not anticipate seeing any of those high recruitment levels in the future. And the overall cumulative catch associated with that is about 12,000 tons. That's over a 10-year period. In contrast, if we use the P-star method, that is just simply taking the current status of the resource with respect to B over BMSY, apply the appropriate level of risk associated with that, and compute an ABC from the OFL. The initial catch in 23 is 8,000 metric, or excuse me, 4,500 metric tons, but it increases overall to basically give you a total 171,000 metric tons, so well over 10 times higher than you would get under the assumption that low recruitment is going to continue in the future. Now, the other three, the remaining three, are sort of theme and variations on that. If you want to be more certain that you have a rebuilding target and that means you're foregoing catch over the longer run. So while you may achieve or allow higher catches initially, at the end of the day, after 10 years, you have 144,000 metric tons in contrast to 171,000 metric tons under option 2. Option 4 is basically you're willing to do slightly less, a lower chance of achieving rebuilding. You can take a little more out at the beginning, and overall you do get a little bit more. Again, still less than the 171. And then finally, if you do forego contemporary catches by applying a P-star to the F rebuild, you're somewhere in like 3,000 metric tons, and that the cumulative is about 134,000 metric tons. So there's some very substantial differences. So the SSC, after considering all these methods, recommended going with the P-star method in and of itself without a special consideration of the rebuilding. So next slide, please. There we go. Thank you. This basically just says, okay, you've looked at all these things, guys. What do you think? So the SSC recommended the P-star approach with a maximum fishing mortality set to the FMSY proxy. And the reasons for that include: one, it fulfills the rebuilding plan requirements. It's most responsive to new information on changes in stock status. It does give the highest rebuilding plan 10-year catch, although it does have lower initial ones than some of the options 3, 4, and 5. It's fully consistent with the council's P-star policy. You don't have to do any special add-ons or adjustments or anything after the fact, or have any long debates about whether or not you're fulfilling the council policy. And it avoids sort of what we call breakpoints. That is, you don't want to have changes from the rebuild F to the new P-star F should effort or rebuilding occur early. So next slide, please. So then we were asked to, evaluate sort of the risks and uncertainties associated with all of these policies. And so they basically fall into two categories. Alternative one, which is the low future recruitment, and then alternative 2 through 5, which are the split model, the two-stage model. So the risks on low future recruitment is that, you're foregoing catch if the stock recovers. You probably are giving up pretty much a lot of your fishery dependent data, which plays a central role in terms of evaluating how the stock is responding both to the environment and fishing pressure. And if you do have one of these large recruitment events during the period, if you're stuck with the low, essentially non-responsive F rebuild, then you're going to get a lot of discard. The scientific uncertainties are of course huge. We don't really know which recruitment regime exists and whether it's the spawning stock, biomass, the environment, food web, all three factors. So there are scientific uncertainties like associated with that. There's also concerns about recreational harvest that aren't factored in, and then of course, as with all projections, that uncertainty propagates and accumulates as the length of the projection increases. Next slide, please. So alternatives 2 through 5, the risks are that the stock may not recover with the lower F because it doesn't change as we hypothesize it will. This trigger, by its nature, is sort of a tectonic application of stock assessment theory. So once you get into this new SSB state, that you're assuming that the recruitment changes quickly, and there may be lags associated with that change. So assuming that it occurs quickly, but in fact, it may take a while for, say, biological aspects of stock, such as increased abundance of larger, more mature females as sort of precursor for improved subsequent recruitment. And we noted, of course, that the SR relationship itself has not been parameterized in the assessment document. So that is a sort of a risk of applying this, although it was worked very closely with Kirsten Curdy in terms of evaluating this as sort of post-assessment environment there. Next slide, please. Uncertainties, I've summarized those or reduced them to a very small set, but of course, reiterating that we don't really know the stock recruitment relationship, that, we really need to have higher level of information about catch, but that's becomes more tricky as the ABCs are low. I mentioned the nature of the trigger SSB, and there is of course difficulty in terms of detecting change at the precision that in any assessment, and particularly one that's rebuilding. Next slide, please. Term of reference 3 was some guidance and recommendations on what should happen for the 2023 mackerel management track assessment, guidance on that. There was a number of concerns raised about the egg surveys, and noted that they really do play the central role in this assessment. And it is, if you had to pick a single factor that differentiates the earlier late 1990s, early 2000 assessments from what is currently done, is that this one does incorporate the mackerel egg survey as kind of the central feature of the fishery independent piece of information. Noted that the recreational sector is not as well represented in the length composition data, which affects age composition. Kind of as a general recommendation is that really should improve the recreational data quality and however possible. We mentioned earlier with respect to golden tilefish about the importance of the shoreside sampling. This is affecting all species. So it's extremely important that information is maintained. If you don't, it is the gift that keeps on giving. And you'll be dealing with this for the next 10 years. And then finally, just some considerations about how the sampling error associated with these egg surveys could be addressed in an explicit and complete fashion. Next slide, please. This is my last one. So during the discussion, there were, as you might expect, or if you participate or attended these meetings, stock recruitment relationships always create a lot of discussion and stimulating scientific debate. But one of the things that I thought might be useful, not only with respect to stock recruitment relationship, but also understanding the projection process, is to try to look at individual trajectories a bit too, just to give a better sense of what can and cannot happen within this projection methodology. So you don't always make even progress towards building. You may actually do some backsliding in some cases. So these rebuilding probabilities can have what you'd call statistically a heavy tail. That is a large chance of some extreme events that may work the perception of the average. As always, it's important to continue to look for the potential environmental drivers for these recent recruitment events. Yesterday, we heard from Sarah Geichis about many of the changes in the environment that are maybe relevant to putting this stock in a low condition, or is it simply a fact that there aren't enough big ones to produce eggs? We noted that monitoring through the management track assessments every 2 years is really the ideal situation, and that as a consequence of that monitoring, we expect adjustments over time. So would anticipate that the SSC and the council will be making and building upon earlier decisions as you go. It's not a set it and forget it like policy. And then finally, just to emphasize again the fact that these decisions, not only about the risk policy, but also about the nature of recruitment, were the consequence of really extensive and well thought discussions within the scientific community and with the council, and as well as partners in DFO Canada. So these weren't taken lightly, and this distillation down to 5 is relatively severe, but I think it does capture sort of the essence of the underlying nature of the stock recruitment process, as well as the challenge of rebuilding. So That concludes my presentation, and I'll turn it back over to you, Jason. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think that kind of provides a really good kind of theoretical underpinning of kind of where we're coming from here. Paul's talked about the 5 options a bit. He's discussed the 2 different recruitment regimes. I think one thing that I'm hopeful that this next projection isn't as off as the last one because of that change in recruitment. And it never actually gets back to even the median recruitment. And it puzzled me a bit because it's like once the biomass is supposed to get above half, the idea is you're sampling from the whole from the whole recruitment. So it's like, first I was like, well, why even at the end when you're fully rebuilt, is that recruitment coming in still lower than what just a straight out median would be for the whole time series? And I think this figure, I'm going to spend a little bit of time with this. This goes a little bit towards the SSC's discussion about trying to communicate some of that uncertainty. And I think it will serve a couple of useful aspects. I've circled there. The orange, yellow, orange is the straight P-star approach, and so the P-star, like many of them, end up around that SSB MSY proxy, the dotted line. It's about a third of the way, horizontal dotted line, about a third of the way up. But one kind of neat thing about this particular graph is that it also has the 90% confidence intervals. So that range on the right of the yellow, that's when Kirsten does the projections, she runs the projections 2,000 times. And each one of those times is sampling, from the recruitment as it goes along. And it's a draw from whatever set we've included, the lower or the higher. And sometimes you get a string of bad events, and that's why even on actually the P-star actually has the lowest of the 90% confidence intervals, just again, based on how it's projecting catch, if you were actually to go all the way to the end of 10 years. And that's why you actually never get to that full recruitment, because even though, P-star, like all of them here, get back to that rebuilt status, there's still some runs that are staying below half of rebuilt. And in those runs, it's picking from the lower recruitment time series. So that's why I think, one reason why hopefully we're not as far off is that, that assuming that lower recruitment, and only, as you kind of have more runs that are hitting that half rebuilt point, drawing from that higher recruitment gives you a better sense, or should, and when you don't see that in the biomass, you don't see that big giant jump in biomass in this rebuilding plan like we saw in the last one. And that's partly because we thought we had a big recruitment event coming in right at the tail end of the last one, and partly because of the recruitment. I think the other thing, you get a sense when you look at that spread of the orange at the end there, there's a pretty wide range of even, so 90% of those 2,000 runs end up, between those top and bottom circles on the right. But there's still 10% of the runs that are even outside of that, higher or lower. You can see on, the one where it's assuming the very low, the lower recruitment for the whole time series and the very, very low catches, that one, has the tightest probability of being, fairly close to the rebuilt status of 10 years because of the very low catch. But once you start introducing catch on top of the uncertainty in recruitment, can see the variability gets quite wide. And so I was going to work with Kirsten before final action to try to get some other ways to kind of illustrate the underlying uncertainty of these projections. But I thought, just getting this up there and seeing how wide the spread is on some of those approaches, might be a start to communicate some of that uncertainty. And I had a little, technically they'd be in, there'd be 10 of these across, but again, the idea is she's doing 2,000 of these runs, some are ending up above, below, et cetera. That median is where the point where half of the runs are below and half of the runs are above. And so, even for any of these, it's still a coin flip whether you're above or below the rebuilding target, roughly, at the end of the time series. Some of the percents are a little higher, some are lower. And this is really just the uncertainty that is, associated with that change in recruitment, and the randomness of that recruitment draw. If, Canada were to start to increase their catches, none of that is kind of uncertainty is built in to our projections of how confident we might be to achieve rebuilding. So these are the Fs for the 5 different scenarios. They may be in a different order than Paul had. If so, apologize for any confusion, but in the document, they're just ordered low to high catch, basically, for the initial years. And, what do those Fs turn into catches? Again, you're talking, initially less than 1,000 for that first one that's assuming you're only going to get low recruitment for the whole rebuilding time period, versus up to about 9,400 total catch. That, again, that would include, then Canada would have to be subtracted off of that. We'll talk about that in a bit later. The other thing I kind of wanted to point out, when you look at these and compare 1 and 3, just in terms of the percents, 1, it says it has a 57% chance of rebuilding, and 3 says 52. Sorry, no, I wanted to compare 1 and 2. 1 says 57, 2 says 62. But, in terms of practice, don't forget, each one of those is conditioned on a recruitment time series. In practice, that number 1 is going to have the best chance of rebuilding, because it still rebuilds even with a constrained lower recruitment. So those percentages are kind of built upon that recruitment assumption. And so, for the P-star option, number 3, it says it has a 52% chance of rebuilding. But a big part of that is because the catches are allowed to increase a lot towards the end. But those catch increases near the end would only occur if biomass was really on track. If biomass wasn't really on track, the catches wouldn't be that high. And so, again, these percentages, I think, are good for some relative comparisons. They're good that we can kind of know that we're kind of in a legal situation of a 50% rebuilding probability within 10 years. But there's, they're constructs of the underlying data, the underlying assumptions. And it's just, I think, good to keep that in mind. That it kind of gets hard to compare given the iterative nature of the assessments that we're going to get, and the council will have to adapt to those. It clouds just looking at these percentages without kind of keeping in mind all that other stuff. So I mentioned Canada earlier. What about Canada? Just wanted to review that, they did just close their fishery for 2022. They caught about 4,400 in 2021. What's the effect of, and why did they do that? It's a little tricky, some of their policy, what they're trying to do, but the best that I can tell is that them going to a zero TAC in 2022, 2023 gives them roughly a coin flip chance of being 40% rebuilt by 2023. They have this kind of lower limit kind of point of 40% rebuilt. That's kind of baked into some of their policy considerations. And again, they had, back a year ago, they had thought about the chances of them getting to this 40% rebuilt with catches in 2021, 2022, 2023. And if the catches were like 0 for their 4,000 for all 3 years, 8,000 maybe for all 4 years. Well, 2020, you can't kind of use that calculation exactly now because they're going to have different catches for those different years. But I think ballpark, that's kind of what's driving their decision there, that, you know, going now to a 0 TAC, you know, kind of gives them a ballpark 50% chance, or maybe a little bit more, but roughly a coin flip chance to kind of get back to that 40% reference point they have by 2023. So just a little context for my understanding of some of what's driving their decision there. So, you know, they're going to have an assessment in 2023, and they'll use that assessment to set for 2023, which means even their quota decision now for 2022 may be of limited utility for us estimating, guessing, you know, what their quota is going to be for 2023. But you know, the document right now has, you know, either assuming their 2021 catch or half of that for 2023. So, you know, there's some trade-offs in either under or over specifying. Either way, we over specify, it's, you know, less catch for the US, we under specify, their catch is higher, we don't rebuild as fast. On paper, maybe some of our alternatives look more workable. But the flip side is, you know, if we under specify for them, we kind of risk an ABC overage and not rebuilding as fast as intended. You know, given my reading of some of their statements and press releases, and understanding of their kind of policy process, you know, I still think that range that's in the document right now is a pretty good central range for where they're likely to be and the catch they're likely to achieve in 2023. You know, might be higher or lower, but I think that probably captures the kind of central tendencies of where they may end up in 2023. So that's kind of what's baked into the document right now. And despite their closure for 2022, I think it's still a reasonable 2 options to look at. So kind of considering that for Canada, the first 2 options that have the lowest catches, you deduct Canada, deduct rec catch, and we're at negative US quota. That, you know, doesn't seem feasible. You know, some might argue you should, you know, why even have those in the document? I think number 1 is good to have in there, that it shows if we don't get even kind of half decent recruitment, you know, rebuilding is going to be a tough slog. And the 2, you know, if you want a really high certainty or a higher certainty of rebuilding, you take that rebuild F, you take, you know, subtract out the P-star deduction. You know, it requires very low catches, especially given the recruitment scenario that we think we're likely to see. So option 3 in the document, which was the SSC's recommendation, still, you know, may not be feasible. If you start with the associate ABC, take out even the lower amount for Canada, take out you know, a somewhat lower amount that we've seen in recent years for rec, take out the discards when we could retain a fair bit of mackerel, you're left with, you know, almost 0 for US landings. And if there was some policy that had almost 0 for US landings, I think it's pretty safe to assume that discards are going to be higher. So, you know, it just seems like, you know, given Canada, given rec, control over rec, I'm not sure that's feasible, but again, I think that's still useful in the document as exploring some of the pros and cons of these different approaches. So 4 and 5 do result in some U.S. commercial quota, depending on, you know, what the council ends up plugging in for Canada and rec catches. In the document, it also states that those options entail a modification of the council's risk policy. Your risk policy right now has a thing in there where if you're rebuilding and the standard P star is less than your rebuilding F, you automatically default back to the P star. So unless kind of the council says, yes, we understand, and our intention is to divert off of our standard risk policy, it's in the regs right now, then 3, the standard P star, is an automatic default. That's how it's written in the regs. It says, if you're in a rebuilding plan and your P star is less than your rebuilding F, the SSC will return P star. So just like the last mackerel rebuilding plan, options 4 and 5, since they do result in catches higher than the standard P star, it says in the document, for this initiation of mackerel rebuilding, the council is intending to modify its risk policy to allow these higher catches as part of the rebuilding plan, because otherwise it just defaults back to P star. Okay, so we're kind of getting into these deductions, and you have to kind of work through some of these deductions to kind of see what the end result is. There were 3 bag limits kind of that staff had worked up at request of committee. And to figure out, so we're trying to estimate, how much catch might be reduced at some of these bag limits. And NIMS S&T provided some code that just bins out, how many trips caught 1 mackerel, 2 mackerel, 3 mackerel, et cetera. And so I went through and said, okay, any trips that were, above 10, force them to 10. So at 20 fish trips, all the 20 fish trips, now if they're 10, recalculate. All the 15, all the 25 fish trips, recalculated 10. What's that reduction? And that's what this slide is here. I'll note the committee has recommended removing the 5 fish limit. Basically, the states have said, they don't see that as viable. They're not likely to implement that. And so there's some benefit in maintaining consistency across state and federal. And if most of the catches in state waters, so if the states don't mirror whatever the feds do, these reductions go away and evaporate because most of the catch occurs in state waters. So again, that 5 fish limit, the committee is recommending getting rid of. Since, I can go through and calculate what those theoretical reductions would be, but we haven't had bag limits on mackerel before. It's very hard to predict angler behavior once you're instituting bag limits. We've had trouble restricting recreational catch to targets in general with fisheries. So what the monitoring committee said, when the council moves forward to calculating the commercial quota, we recommend you kind of take 1 of 2 approaches. Either to stick with the recent average catch for rec, that's the 2582 metric tons, or assume there's going to be some less catch, but not as much as predicted, just half of what that calculation of kind of turning the dials on all those different trips down to the bag limit would be. So this table just describes, if you went with that kind of 50% credit on a spreadsheet, what the savings look like might be, what the deductions would be. Instead of deducting 2582, deducting either 2195 or 2298, depending on the bag limit. So then, and this is a little different than it's a very similar table in the public hearing document, but I added here kind of 3 deductions for the rec, the 2,500 or the 10 or 15 fish amounts, just to kind of work that through. And let's see if the drawing works on here. Color. I was going to try to draw through, but I'll just use my cursor. Okay. So, this is alternative 4. It's the target 60% rebuild. When we calculated it out, and there's a typo here, sorry. It's 61% rebuild. It rounds to, this is what it rounds to with the F. If you go a little higher F, it doesn't quite rebuild, but the F that does rebuild, the closest you can get at a kind of rounded F was 61%. So you start with 8,094. It's got the two options for Canada in here, about 2,200 or 4,400. It's got the 3 rec catch options, either sticking with the average, the 2,582, or some deductions for a 10 or 15 bag limit, 115 for commercial discards. And you can kind of see the range of commercial quotas you get depending on those set-asides for option number 2, 1,000 metric tons to about 3,600 metric tons. And I'll touch on the lower rows after walking through on number 5. You know, it starts a little higher at close to 9,400 metric tons, and then the commercial quotas are just the same amount higher, right? Same kind of range of deductions for Canada or rec and commercial discards. So then for in-season management on the commercial side, and we kind of have a system of percentage closures. You know, at these relatively low quotas, it's going to be hard to know exactly how the fishery operates. When is it going to close? How long is it going to be closed for? What happens after it closes? Our general goal, you know, with these closures in mackerel and butterfish have been to try to avoid creating a big regulatory discarding situation. So we looked at landings the last few years. After April 1, the fishery hasn't been very active. What landings have occurred after April 1? Increase those landings by 10%, extend that period to May 1. And so, you know, it says when we've got 886 metric tons left of quota, close at that point and go to some trip limits. Those are described in more details in the document. And then kind of get a stricter trip limit with 443 metric tons and so on down to 100 metric tons. So the idea is to kind of slow this fishery down. I think it's you know, myself and the monitoring committee think it's a reasonable approach, but could definitely go over or under depending on exactly what point in the year it closes. But you know, like the rest of mackerel rebuilding will have to be a bit of an adaptive approach. But based on recent landings, you wouldn't expect it to come real high over or real far under with that closure approach. I think I can skip this. Paul touched on that. You know, I'll highlight those other slides, but I think this is worth just reiterating. You know, the uncertainty that, you know, the update has shown us versus the last projections kind of highlights it, and you know, there are no guarantees here. So the document has a couple other measures in there, a 3-inch minimum mesh. We don't have a lot of input information on what that would do. There just haven't been a lot of studies for mackerel trawling on a 3-inch minimum mesh. The Canadians do have some minimum mesh on their purse seine fishery. It varies by area, and they're going to send that along to me. So I'm not quite sure how applicable it is, but we'll see what we find there. Has river herring and shad cap in there also. Either, you know, the last few years, we've kind of stated a 129 metric ton base. If you scale that river herring and shad cap to some of these quotas, the caps are tiny. And, you know, given the limited observer coverage, are going to be, I think, very hard to monitor. And so that's a discussion of those two options is in there. There is a permitting option in there. The regs are hard to interpret in terms of the need for different vessels to have a mackerel permit in federal waters. In one section, it says if you possess mackerel in federal waters, you need a permit. Another section doesn't include possession in the list of prohibitions if you don't have a permit. So there's an option there to basically make it very clear that if you're in possession of any Atlantic mackerel in federal waters, you'd have to have a permit. And kind of some of the back and forth we had with enforcement early on is that if that doesn't extend to bait, it's going to be hard to enforce. And because what was brought as bait, obviously bait wouldn't have to be reported, but as in the document right now, it would clarify that possession triggers that permitting requirement. And the big thing with the permitting requirement, it triggers VTRs, which means you have to report all catch on any trip. Once you have that permit, we have done some, started to do a little bit of overlap analysis that I do plan to add to the document before we go out to public hearings. There is some overlap with HMS permits that already have some GARFO permit that requires this, but there still are, I think it might only be a third of the HMS head boat and about 10 or 15% of the tuna gen cat on the HMS side that also have existing VTR reporting requirements. So that would be, if they want to use mackerel for bait, that could trigger some, a lot more permitting and reporting depending on, again, if they want to use mackerel for bait. Adam brought up at the last meeting that, this would be a change in terms of how people operate. People are not operating that if they buy a flat of mackerel right now, that they would need a permit, either on the commercial or for hire side of things. So that would be a change, would obviously require a lot of outreach. There was some discussion, if it applies to mackerel, would it apply to squid and butterfish? The regs are equally unclear about if that is an existing requirement. In one section it is, in one section it might not be. I think my suggestion would be, and I have to double check if I added it to the document, but I think I discussed it at the committee, that one option could be, and it wouldn't necessarily need any change to the document right now, but the council could kind of think about it and get some input and clarify during public hearings of, making that specific to mackerel, that in terms of if you buy a flat of bait, a flat of, squid or butterfish that's previously purchased as bait is not triggering that permitting requirement to possess it in the easy, but mackerel does. And I think, it's the extra concern tied to the stock status there. But right now, the provision in the document is just, blanket requirement, making it clear that mackerel possession in the EEZ would trigger the permitting and reporting requirements. So monitoring committee input, a lot of the input is already folded into the draft. Just setting specs for 2023 was a monitoring committee thing. We've discussed that a good bit. I think most of these we've covered. We think probably have another separate AP meeting before decision making, but we did kind of ask the AP to weigh in on this as they're creating a fishery performance report. And we've had minimal mackerel landings in 2022 so far. They reported that at least part of that is due to the inshore midwater trawl ban in New England that may be going away, but is in effect currently and has been for this year and a good bit of last year. Some concern about, control or lack thereof on the recreational catch. Concern if, Canada has no catch, the US has minimal catch, then, what are you going to be using for data to assess rebuilding? Hopefully we still have the egg survey, but a lot of that age data that the assessment integrates is we won't have a lot. And then ongoing concern about how this US and Canada issue, are the approaches at odds or complementing? I think from our perspective, we're trying to account for their catch. So, I see, the US approach, we're looking at the whole stock. We're accounting for their catches as best we can. we have not had a lot of circumstances where we've underestimated their catch substantially in recent history. But there is concern certainly on their end with their closure. Like, are they closing just for us to catch fish that are spawning in their waters and they're not landing this year because of their closure? So I imagine there'll be ongoing kind of U.S.-Canada kind of concerns by all parties. Okay, so the committee recommended trimming that bag limit to 10 or 15 fish based on the state input. There had been some initial discussion of recreational seasonal closures, maybe for a big chunk of the year, especially if the states weren't going to do anything. That led to a lot of concern by folks who fish for striped bass and tuna, and during some informational sessions we had. So that's not in the document. It had been kicked around a bit. So the committee also passed a motion clarifying that they're recommending that that seasonal closure on the rec side be put into consider but rejected. And then again, I touched on the permitting discussion. So you'll have the committee motions to consider. Any further document recommendations. Given the compressed timeline, we do have hearings on the books, 2 in Massachusetts, 1 in New Hampshire, 1 in Maine, and then 1 webinar for anybody with a public comment due date in early May. So we kind of had to again, if the council had some major issue, it could reevaluate, but given the timing with the June council meeting, we had to kind of move things along. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks, Paul, for the information and presentation. I mentioned that we'll take a quick break, but let's see if there are any direct questions for Jason regarding the presentation or for Paul at this time. Michelle?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Jason, remind me real quick, I know you included in the supplemental, like the Canadian announcement of the closure of their commercial directed and bait fishery, but they also have a recreational fishery too. So is that also closed as well?
No, they're recreational fishery and also maybe some provisions for ceremonial or social use of mackerel. Also, those are not closed. They do have a size limit and a bag limit that they've put in the last couple of years, but they don't have a recreational survey that's active regularly like we do.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, members of the council? Anyone from the audience have any questions for Jason or Paul? Michelle, if you can put your hand down, it would be helpful. Thank you. Okay, well, let's go to the audience. I've got Mike Wayne. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Jason. Good presentation. I like how you did a deep dive there. I'm just trying to wrap my head around how are we going to manage the recreational fishery on this? If a bag limit were to go into place, 10 or 15 fish, how will we evaluate the performance of the rec fishery, and will we end up chasing the RHL in this fishery, which is something we're trying to get away from in some of the other mid-Atlantic recreational species? So hopefully you can provide some clarity there. Thanks.
Go ahead, Jason.
So there's no RHL per se. We're just deducting expected recreational catch. So I think we'd observe what happens. Magnuson requires kind of some sharing of rebuilding pain and gain. So I think the general idea is that the data suggests that this would provide some limit on the recreational side. And I think it could pass a straight face test that there's some contribution on the rec side. And I think the evaluation will be, what are catches in the next year or two under a particular bag limit. The council and NIMS will decide if that's kind of sufficient per Magnuson. But But right now, it's just a deduction. We try to anticipate what that catch will be and deduct it when catching the commercial quota. There's no RHL to exceed or not exceed in this case.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Next, I have Percy Bennett Nickerson. Percy?
Hey, yeah, I'm on the webinar. I had a couple of questions. The first one is with the river herring and shad catch cap, if the choice was to scale it to the quota, would there also be a cap if for some reason recruitment did go up and catch were allowed to be increased to a degree that might push the envelope on the original like 129 metric ton cap? And then my second question would be, and I've brought this up before at some of the other committee meetings, but it does seem to me that there ought to be some thought process of including an alternative that actually sticks to the original time frame. I mean, we're on our second round for attempting a macro rebuilding plan, and the original time frame would have started, I believe, in 2021, November of 2021, and ultimately the 10-year requirement. There at least should be some thought or an alternative or the ability to consider having it rebuilt within the original time frame. I mean, I realize we're pushing up against a fairly tight timeline as it is, but it does seem that that ought to be part of the thought process.
Jason?
So on the river herring and shad cap, I think it's kind of set as, you know, the 129 being a floor, and then kind of going back to scaling with as was done before, is my understanding of the intent. The idea that being, you know, the original idea with the cap is it's tied to an encounter rate, as a kind of a base year historic encounter rate. And so if the fishery could fish relatively with less encounters, then it's probably not going to close. And if it gets into relatively high encounters relative to that base year, then the odds of a closure to some degree go up. And then so that kind of slid up and down with the mackerel quota to kind of maintain that same pressure on the fishery to avoid river herring and shad. At really low quotas, it gets really hard to monitor. And so I think that's why the council decided just to kind of not drop it down below 129 at lower mackerel quotas. So I think the idea is that my understanding is that that original intent kind of hasn't changed, and that if DAH did float up above you know, that original encounter rate, then the cap would scale accordingly. But I don't think that's going to be an issue in the near future, given the quotas we're looking at. On the rebuilding time frame, I mean, the original plan was rebuilt by 2023. That's what the projection suggested. My understanding from NIMS, when we're, you know, starting, you know, given the new assessment, given where we are, that you know, the council could, you know, was within its purview to take the SSC advice, focus on different likelihoods of achieving rebuilding in 10 years. That's not the case, then the council could entertain other timelines, but that's my understanding of kind of how we ended up in these options that all kind of are focused on 10 years, but then based on the different catches have, you know, different likelihoods of, you know, having stock growth over time.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Anyone else with any questions? Okay, back to the council. I don't see any hands at this time. Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 3 o'clock and we'll set up and consider the committee motions before we adjourn for the day. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started again. see if we can wrap up here this afternoon. So as Jason mentioned, the committee met to discuss this document, and Peter has a couple motions on behalf of the committee. So when we get that up, Peter, I'll turn to you to make those motions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe we have two committee motions and then a motion to move the document forward at the end that I will be making. And if I could just ask Jason if you could make that a little larger. It's really small on my screen. Thank you. First motion, I move that the council include an alternative in the amendment that considers a range of recreational bag limit options of 10 or 15 fish. This was a committee motion and it was a unanimous consent motion. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Peter. I think some of the rationale for this was already discussed in Jason's presentation. So I'm going to look around to the council for any comments, any discussion on this motion. Anyone from the audience have anything they want to add to the discussion on this motion? Okay, seeing none, is there any objection to the motion by the council? Seeing no objection, the motion carries by unanimous consent. Any abstentions? No abstentions. Thank you. Peter, come back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The second motion I have from the committee today is I move that the recreational seasonal closures be considered but rejected.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Motion's made on behalf of the committee, does not need a second. Is there any discussion on this motion? Any discussion? Any objection? Seeing none, motion carries by unanimous consent. And I believe, Peter, we have, unless there is anything else to be considered that was not part of the discussion by the committee, I'll provide that opportunity now if anyone has anything else that they wanted to bring up. Okay, seeing no hands, Peter, I'm going to look to you for a motion.
Stand by one moment. Okay, this is not a committee motion. The motion reads, I move that the council take the document as perfected out to public hearings. And that would need a second. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Do I have a second? Wes Townsend seconds that motion. Should we specify maybe what document this is? Just a little more. The Atlantic Mackerel Rebuilding 2.0 amendment. Okay, that's good. Okay, any discussion? Okay, seeing no discussion, is there any objection? Michelle?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, thanks. I couldn't quite find my hand raise feature among all my overlapping documents on my screen. I guess maybe just one thing, Jason, in the document, when we talk about the rec bag limits, just considering the discussion that the committee had about sort of the ambiguity in the regulations on possession, do we need to make it clear that that bag limit is a possession limit in the document? I was looking back to just try to see if that's in there. I mean, we talk about it being just a bag limit. I just want to make sure that there's no misunderstanding when it goes out to the public that, you know, a 10 fish or a 15 fish bag limit is a 10 or 15 fish possession limit. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, that was my understanding of the council's intent, so I can make that clear in the document.
Okay, thank you. Any other discussion? Any objection? Seeing no objection, are there any abstentions? No abstentions, motion carries by unanimous consent. Is there anything else that we need to take up, Jason, before we conclude this item on the agenda today?
I think we're good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all for your time and effort today. So we're done for the day.